In late summer of 480 BC, 300 Spartan soldiers stood in the way of thousands of Persians. And that was the supposed interaction between King Xerxes, who is the ruler of the Persian Empire, who had hundreds of thousands of men at his command, and that was King Leonidas, who had less than 1,000 men there standing in Xerxes' way. Actually, at the time, he probably had close to 10,000 people in the way of Xerxes from taking over Greece. And Xerxes is there trying to persuade him not to fight. But there was a place known as Thermopylae, or the Hot Gates, and it was a small pass on the east side of Greece. And on one side of the pass stood mountainous cliffs. On the other side stood the ocean. And that pass was only approximately 50 feet wide. And so what King Leonidas there had done is he had stuffed his men in that little tiny pass and basically said, "You will not get through here." And long story short, for 3 days, the Persians came running in there by the thousands and thousands and thousands, and the Spartan soldiers and the Greek soldiers just wiped them out. They had no way of getting through. And finally, on the third day, someone got captured, or someone turned code. I forget exactly how this happened, but someone showed Xerxes' army a small path that went up through the mountain that they could swing their force. They could swing a group of men up around and get behind them. And they could entrap these Spartans and Greek soldiers. Well, the guy told them. They started up and they got up over there. And when King Leonidas realized that he had been outflanked and that they were in fact going to fall, he sent most of his soldiers back up into Greek to reform and fight another day, essentially. And he took his 300 men, and unlike the movie said, there was like another 700 men that were there with him that, for whatever reason, they couldn't go home if they didn't win the battle, essentially. And so about a force of around about 1,000 men stood their ground. The 700 turned and fought the people from behind, and King Leonidas and his 300 fought the men coming on from the front. And they were literally facing more than 100,000. The guesstimate is around 150 to 200,000 soldiers is what they were facing. Back in the day, they thought it was millions, but it was just because you couldn't count them. There were so many. So they fought, and we all know the story that unlike what Xerxes was saying, they died, but the story got told. And the story got told over and over and written about over and over. And it has been celebrated over and over. And movies, yes, movies have been made about it. And eventually, it became an inspiration for free men essentially everywhere. And I saw that and I was inspired. I thought, I wonder if anything like that has happened in modern day times. And I started looking around and I thought, has a truly overmatched force in modern day times had to do battle in a situation that was just seemingly a death wish? And there were several instances that I could have looked at, but I kind of like the one in 1948. In 1948, the British ruled much of Northern Africa and the Middle East. Well, they started pulling out of different places, and they started putting up governments to govern these places. And one of the places that they were governing was a place called Palestine. And in Palestine, they had Jews that had been coming back by the droves and resettling because of what had taken place in World War II in Europe with the Holocaust. Jews were being driven out, and they were all recollecting back in the Holy Land. But the Palestinians that had lived there for probably 1,000 years by that point were not about to go anywhere, so they were all living there, but it was under British rule, and British, they were ruling kind of with an iron fist. You guys play nice together. It's kind of like having a parent in the room. Well, 1948, I want to say, what was the date? Shucks, I don't have the date written here. I did have it earlier. But anyway, in 1948, the British decided that they were going to withdraw. And so they set up a state that was supposed to, it was called Palestine. It was supposed to be with both the Israelis and the Palestinians. But during this year or so leading up to it, they started having civil war in that state. Regardless of whether the British were there or not, they started fighting in amongst themselves. And when the day came for the British to pull out, the Palestinians had basically made the commitment, and the Arabs around them, the Arab countries, had made the commitment to drive the Israelis into the sea. And so the Israelis, the day before the withdrawal, declared the statehood of Israel. So the day after the British rule was over, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria, along with the Palestinians that were already living there, attacked Israel. What we know of today as Israel. It was the Israelis. There were approximately 600,000 Israelis living in that area at the time. Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, and the Palestinians already in Palestine that were dedicated to driving the Israelis into the sea were approximately 30 million people. You had an overall battle ratio there of about 50-1. And they attacked, and it looked like things were dim and grim and bad for the Israelis. The Israelis didn't even have a common fighting force. All they had were these militias that were fighting against the different places of the Palestinians attacking them. Well, long story short, within a day or two, they got their stuff together. They formed the IDF, which is the Israeli Defense Forces, and they went on the offensive. They not only took the first blow, but then they went on the offensive. They actually added 50% to their land, declared themselves a sovereign nation, and won. And in the Arabic tongue, that war is known as the catastrophe. In the Israeli language, in the Hebrew, that war is known as the War of Independence. And so over the next 20 years, that whole fighting thing continued. They kept, one side would aggress, the other side would, shoot back. It was just constantly back and forth over the next 20 years. So in 1967, these 5 countries that surrounded Israel all started to amass their troops on the borders. And they shut off shipping into Israel, and they kind of, boxed them in and were getting ready to attack. Well, the Israelis, seeing what was going on, and they had had another war in the interim, and during that war, they had been hurt pretty bad before they fought back and regained their borders. This time they attacked. And again, the odds were not all that great in their number at all. In fact, they were outnumbered 5-1 in professional soldiers. They were outnumbered 3-1 in tanks, and they were outnumbered 3-1 in aircraft. And during that war, it was known as the 6-Day War or the Lightning War. And during those 6 days, they killed 22,000 of the Arabs. They captured 5,000 of the Arabs, and they lost less than 1,000 of their own men, and they tripled the size of their nation in 6 days. And I look at that and I'm thinking, man, is it coincidence? Is it luck? I thought it's hardly either. I think they come by it honestly because they actually have a heritage of fighting against the odds with God on their side and conquering absolutely astronomical enemies. And that takes us to where we're starting in Genesis. We are still in Genesis. We're in chapter 14 today. I'm going to read you a story. And it's kind of like the situation with the 300. But instead of the 300 losing, God was on the side of the 300 in this particular story. And they win. And it's almost the exact same situation. It's 300 men against probably close to 50 to 100,000 men. And we're going to see later that God has another story where it's 300 men against more than 100,000. And they win. Genesis 14, verse 1. About this time, war broke out in the region. King Armaphal of Babylonia, King Arioch of Elazar, and King Kedorlaomer of Elam, and King Tidal of Goyim fought against King Bera of Sodom, King Bersha of Gomorrah, King Shinab of Admah, King Shemimber of Zoibim, and the king of Bela, also called Zoar. This second group of kings joined forces in Siddim Valley, that is the valley of the Dead Sea. For 12 years they had been subject to King Kedorlaomer, but in the 13th year they rebelled against him. 1 year later, Kedorlaomer and his allies arrived and defeated the Rephaites at Ashtoreth Karnaim, the Zuzites at Ham, the Emites at Sheva Kiriathaim, and the Horites at Mount Seir, as far as El Paran at the edge of the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to En Mishpat, now called Kadesh, and conquered all the territory of the Amalekites. Also, the Amorites living in Hazazon Tamar. Then the rebel kings of Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah, Zoibim, and Bela, also called Zoar, prepared for battle in the valley of the Dead Sea. They fought against King Kedorlaomer of Elam, King Tidal of Goyim, King Amraphel of Babylonia. I think that was closer than the first time I tried. King Arioch of Elazar, 4 kings against 5. As it happened, the valley of the Dead Sea was filled with tar pits. And as the army of the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some fell into the tar pits, while the rest escaped into the mountains. The victorious invaders then plundered Sodom and Gomorrah and headed for home, taking with them all the spoils of war and the food supplies. They also captured Lot, Abram's nephew, who lived in Sodom, and carried off everything he owned. But one of Lot's men escaped and reported everything to Abram, the Hebrew, who was living near the oak belonging to Mamre, the Amorite. Mamre and his relatives, Eshcol and Aner, were Abram's allies. When Abram heard that his nephew Lot had been captured, now get a load of this. He mobilized the 318 men who had been born into his household, the trained men, the 318 trained men who had been born into his household. Then he pursued Kedorlaomer's army until he caught up with them at Dan. Now I want you to get this picture. This army, led by 4 kings, has just wiped out 11 nations and kings. 11 of them. Word gets back to Abram that his nephew has been taken by these 4 kings who's just come in and wiped out, nation after nation, king after king, army after army, just wiped them all out. And he says, well, shucks, they got my nephew. He grabs 318 men and takes off after them. Today, that would be called utter praised stupidity, because he's probably facing a force of at least 40 to 80,000 men that are trained warriors that have just wiped out 11 armies. Okay, so he takes the 318 men and takes off in pursuit. Verse 15, there he divided his men and attacked during the night. Kedorlaomer's army fled, but Abraham chased them as far as Hobah, north of Damascus. Abraham recovered all the goods that had been taken, and he brought back his nephew Lot with his possessions and all the women and other captives. You know, you look at that and you think, why on earth would the guy go and attack an army that has just effortlessly defeated 11 kingdoms? Especially for a guy who had just finished, remember last week, he just finished being selfish and treating Abraham poorly because of his own selfishness. And I thought, you know, a lot of us would have looked at that and said, you know, he shouldn't have been so selfish, should he? That's just a consequence of what, you know, you get what you know, what goes around comes around. Well, sorry for you, buddy. But Abraham didn't do that because, number one, Lot was family. And number two, it was simply the right thing to do, to forgive. And I realize a lot of you would have been like Abraham in that you would have forgiven, because God says to forgive. The disciples come up to Jesus one time and they say, how many times are we supposed to forgive? 7 times? Because 7 times was looked at as the holiest thing that you could do. That's what the Pharisees taught you were supposed to forgive 7 times in a day. And Jesus says, no, not 7 times. You should forgive 70 times 7. And Abraham somehow, way back in the day, had already gotten that. And he had forgiven Lot completely. And I mean, you have to think, it's got to be pretty complete, the forgiveness, to go and throw your life right out on the line for the guy. God takes forgiveness seriously, and Abraham took God seriously, and so he forgave. But forgiving wasn't the only thing he did. He also grabbed his sword and chased down this ginormous army. And he attacked them when he caught up with them. And I'm thinking, you know, how crazy was it? Can you imagine being there when they caught up to him? You're sitting there with 318 men. You're looking at Abram like, what on earth are you doing here, dude? And he looks at you and says, you know, we're probably outnumbered 300, 400 to 1, maybe 1,000 to 1. We better think this through. Instead of just attacking them head on, we better make it at night. I mean, that was the extent of the strategy. We'll split into 2 and we'll attack at night. And crazy as it was, God gave him victory. Now, why did God give him victory? Because God had promised to bless him. God couldn't bless a dead man. He couldn't bless a household that had been wiped out. And I guess he walked on what God had previously said to him, that he was going to bless him and make his descendants as numerous as the stars of the sky. So he believed what God said, and because he believed what God said, he acted on what God said, and he was not afraid. But here's the craziest thing of all. It's not an isolated incident in the Bible that kind of thing happened. In fact, this particular story is eerily similar to one found in Judges 6. In Judges 6, the Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight, and the Lord handed them over to the Midianite nation for 7 years. But the Midianites were cruel and kind of inhumane in the way that they treated the Israelites. They came in and they would wipe out their grain fields, and then they would take all of their animals, and they literally would leave the Israelites with nothing to eat. And they did it year after year. They would come in and they would literally just cover the area. The Bible says that they came in with their livestock and their tents, and they were as thick as locusts. They arrived on droves of camels, too numerous to count, and they stayed until the land was stripped bare. The Bible also says that Israel was reduced to starvation by the Midianites. Then Israel cried out to the Lord. And it's a shame that it takes in our lives to the point where we are desperate sometimes before we'll cry out to God. We always want to try to do it our own way, do it in our own strength, etc., etc. But after they were driven literally to starvation by the Midianites, then the Israelites realized, you know what, we've abandoned God, let's cry out to God. So, verse 7 in chapter 6 of Judges, the Lord sent a prophet. What's funny about when God sends a prophet, it's almost never a positive thing. And essentially it's the preacher. He sends the preacher, and what's the preacher say? The preacher says, well, you guys abandoned God. That's why you're struggling. That's why it's awful. That's why you don't have food. That's why everything's taken from you. Everyone loves the preacher, right? Yeah, everyone loves the preacher. But then, after God sent the preacher, he also sent an angel of the Lord. And the angel of the Lord went and he appeared to a guy named Gideon. And he walks up to this guy. This guy is hiding out. The Midianites have come and Gideon's hiding out. He is literally in the basement of the basement of a wine press, and he's hiding, sifting grain so that he can have something to eat. He snuck this grain down here so that no one can find him while he's sifting it out. And so while he's in hiding, trying to keep from getting his grain stolen and getting killed, the angel of the Lord appears to him and says, "Mighty hero, the Lord is with you." It's kind of dissonant, isn't it? You're sitting there hiding out, scared to death that someone's going to find you, and an angel appears and says, "Mighty hero, the Lord is with you." And I looked at that and I thought, there is a principle here that we should probably take away with us, and that is this. God sees us where we're going to be. We only see ourselves where we're at right now. We only see ourselves in the hardships, in the frustrations, in the limitations, in all of those things that we are experiencing right here today. God sees us well beyond that. He deals with us in the well beyond that. But we, unfortunately, struggle with that. Verse 13, Gideon says, "Sir, if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? And where are the miracles our ancestors told us about? Didn't they say the Lord brought us out of Egypt, but now the Lord has abandoned us and handed us over to the Midianites?" Then the Lord turned to him and said, "Go with the strength you have and rescue Israel from the Midianites. I am sending you." Go with the strength that you have. That particular phrase has always kind of caught me off guard. Go with the strength that you have. This is very similar to Abraham's situation. And Abraham couldn't gather a whole army. All he could do was get what was right there in front of him and chase them down. And I thought about that, and I thought, how does that apply to us? Go with what you've got. And I thought about it, I thought, sometimes we sit around and wait for the odds to change. We sit around and we wait, hoping that somehow, the tide's going to turn. But that's not what God says. He says, if I'm sending you, if I'm telling you, if this is something I'm doing, there's no waiting until it all lines up. You just go and do what I say. All the consequences are mine. Go with what you have. Quit waiting for the odds to change, because most of the time, folks, they never will. If you're waiting for the odds to change, if you're waiting for things to look favorable, it's probably never going to take place. Kind of a stupid ADD thought. I remember someone telling us at one point, if you're waiting until you can afford a kid, you'll never have a kid. Have a kid. You'll find a way to survive. But I thought about this, and I thought, for me, how this applies, we planted a church here. And sometimes things go super well, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes you have to go with what you have. If I waited until everything was perfect and everything lined up, there would never be a church planted anywhere in the nation. Sometimes you just go with what you've got and you obey God, and then you let the consequences and the long term and what God is going to do, it's in His hands. I have to stop lamenting what I don't have. And we as a church, if those of you walk around and say, there's just not enough people, stop lamenting what's not there and start going with what you do have. And when God first talked to me about preaching and doing all this stuff, I really did. I focused on what I didn't have. Because that's what I had been taught. I focused on the fact that I'm ADD. I focused on the fact that I'm a horrible administrator. God says, go with what you've got. There's administrators out there that will beat your brains in, keep you straight, keep you in line. Go with what you've got. And so here we are today with what we have. But sometimes we have to go with what we've got. If God is telling you or sending you, excuses are nothing. So anyway, the Lord went on and said to him, I will be with you and will destroy the Midianites as if you were fighting against one man. And that just brings us back to really, at the end of the day, in all of our issues of life, we think it's all about lining things up and knocking down it's not. All of life's battles are God's. In the end, it's all God. So the odds really don't mean anything in life. The battles aren't ours to begin with. They've always been and will always be God's. So Gideon's great reply, a man of profound faith, he said, if you're truly going to help me, show me a sign. Unfortunately, that became sort of an ongoing issue with Gideon. God showed him a sign the first time. And of course, he ended up doing it with the fleeces and all that other stuff. But anyway, God has this interaction with Gideon, and soon afterwards, the armies of Midian, Amalek, and the people of the east formed an alliance against Israel and crossed the Jordan, camping in the valley of Jezreel. Then the Spirit of the Lord took possession of Gideon. And I thought about that, and I thought, and Gideon goes and he organizes an army to go out and fight him. But I thought about that and I thought, that's probably our responsibility. In all of this, God fights the battle. Our responsibility is to be available for the Spirit of God to come and take possession of us and do with us as He desires and has designed us for. So the key is, we don't have to be ready to go do everything. It'd be great if we were. We get ourselves as ready as we can be, but at the end of the day, what we really need to be ready for is for God to come and fill us and take over and do what He wants to do. Okay, jumping over to chapter 7. So Gideon and his army got up early and went as far as the spring of Herod. They went out to meet the Midianites. The armies of Midian were camped north of them in the valley near the hill of Morah. The Lord said to Gideon, "You have too many warriors with you. If I let all of you fight the Midianites, the Israelites will boast to me that they have saved themselves by their own strength. Therefore tell the people, whoever is timid or afraid may leave this mountain and go home." They're facing approximately 150,000 plus warriors on the other side. The army that they're facing is huge. They've got 32,000 men. And he says, whoever's afraid, you can go home. So 22,000 of them went home, leaving only 10,000 who were willing to fight. But the Lord told Gideon, there's still too many. Isn't that funny? Bring them down to the stream, and I will test them to determine who will go with you and who will not. Then Gideon took his warriors down to the water. The Lord told him, divide the men into two groups. In one group, put all those who cup water in their hands and lap it with their tongues like dogs. In the other group, put all those who kneel down to drink with their mouths in the stream. Only 300 of the men drank the water from their hands. All the others got down on their knees and drank with their mouths in the stream. The Lord then told Gideon, with these 300 men, I will rescue you and give you victory over the Midianites. Send all the others home. So Gideon collected the provisions, the ram's horns, and the other warriors and sent them home. From the other warriors and sent them home. But he kept 300 with him. You get the theme of 300 today? Huh? See how I started with 300? We went to 318, now we're back to 300. So he's there with only 300 men. So I'll just give you the synopsis. He takes his 300 men. He surrounds this Midianite camp. He blows the trumpet and he breaks he had jars over torches, and he breaks the torches. And they blow the trumpets and they're surrounding the camp, and the Midianites just go crazy. And they all start fighting each other. And they all started killing one another and running. Then Gideon sent for the area around him and called out the warriors that he had just sent home to pick up the chase. And this is the thing that I thought was cool. 120,000 men got killed in the infighting and with the Israelites coming from other areas to attack as they were trying to flee. But some of them had gotten across the river. 15,000 of them got across the river with two kings. And I love this. Chapter 8, verse 4. Gideon then crossed the Jordan River with his 300 men. He still just got his 300, but you understand 120,000 men have died. And his full 300 men are still there, healthy as can be. See, God's men are brave too. The difference is God's men win, as opposed to King Leonidas. Gideon then crossed the Jordan with his 300 men, and though exhausted, they continued to chase the enemy. These 300 guys have been chasing him the whole time. I love this. And he comes up to some places and says, give me food, and they've already seen 15,000 of the other warriors come through, and they say, well, when you catch them and kill them, then come back. And he did. But verse 10, by this time Zebah and Zalmunna, those were the kings, were in Karkor with 15,000 warriors, all that remained of the allied armies of the east, for 120,000 had already been killed. Gideon circled around by the caravan route east of Nobah and Jacobah, taking the Midianite army by surprise. 300 men attacking? I'd be surprised. Zebah and Zalmunna, the two Midianite kings, fled, but Gideon chased them down and captured all their warriors. He goes on, he kills Zebah and Zalmunna because they had killed some of his relatives. Anyway, long story short, 300 guys. 300 guys take down an army of about 150,000. We can't live for God and live calculated lives. Sometimes the odds simply have to be ignored if we are going to follow what God tells us to do. We need to live oftentimes against the odds. We have to swim against the stream when God says swim against the stream. Real faith doesn't look at numbers. It simply does the right thing and trusts all the outcomes to God. Jonathan, who was David's son, King Saul's son, he was David's best friend. He by himself took on an entire army and won. Shammah, one of David's mighty men, stood his ground in a grain field when the rest of his troops ran away. His whole little army there that he had with him to fight these Philistines that were coming, they all took off and ran. This guy by himself stood in the grain field and fought and beat back the entire Philistine army, the Bible tells us. And David was just a shepherd boy when he sprinted across the battlefield and took down Goliath. Odds were not in his favor. He also stood with another one of his mighty men by the name of Eleazar. When their army fled, the two of them stood in a field and fought and defeated the Philistine army by themselves. It says the rest of the army didn't even come back until it was time just to collect the spoils. And David's man there, Eleazar, they had to peel his hand off his sword. He was so tired. Now, I look at that, and God's way is not the safe way. It's simply not the safe way. Insurance adjusters should not apply for this whole following God thing. If you're all about lining everything up in your life in perfection, you really shouldn't be trying to follow God, because God is going to take you out into no man's land. He does things like that. He takes a few loaves and fish and feeds thousands. He takes one small meal enough to feed just a widow and her boy and die. And he feeds the prophet, the widow, and her boy for years. God's never constrained by what the odds are. In fact, that's the crazy part. He specializes in stacking the odds against us. He specializes in it. He had 32,000 men. But he got no glory from that. That's just a good victory. He had to whittle it down till it was, 1,000 almost to 1. Then he gains the glory and he gains the victory. And at the end of the day, that's why we're here. We're here for his glory, for his honor, for his purposes. You can't live in a safe little shell and live for God that way. We're supposed to be a people of faith. And it takes faith to truly live for God in obedience, because he takes joy in great victories. And great victories don't happen when everything's safe. They just don't. So here's the challenge. The challenge is to do what he says. Period. It doesn't matter whether it adds up. It doesn't matter whether it makes sense. You simply do what he says. Period. Whether it seems impossible or not. You do it, and then you leave the consequences to him. There is no great victory without the numbers and the odds adding up against us, because in the end they mount to nothing. When God's involved, the probabilities mean nothing. All they amount to is his glory and his honor. Only obedience counts. And the question that has to be asked of us today is, do we believe in God enough to obey Him? Regardless of what it looks like, do we simply believe Him enough to obey Him? It's never what you have to work with, but it's who you're working for. So often we think it has to do with what we're working with, and that has nothing to do with anything. The only question that we have to answer is, who are we working for? Do you trust God enough that He can stack the odds against you and you'll still obey Him with your job, with your finances, with your relationships, with your family, with your reputation, with your life? Do you actually trust God? We call ourselves believers. Are we believers in the God of the Bible? Let's pray.